Hi, everyone, and welcome to Deeply Rooted Data, exploring traditional and indigenous best practices for storytelling. My name is John Effinger. I'm with Texas Health Institute located in Austin, Texas. My pronouns are he, him. I am 70 years old, wearing a teal shirt, bald with gray hair on the side. And my background is a picture of the Austin, Texas skyline taken from the middle of Lady Bird Lake, which was Lyndon B. Johnson, former president. His wife was Lady Bird. So that will give you a description of who I am and background. We'll start today with a few accessibility and technical support reminders. This training is recorded. We will include ASL interpretation on screen and in closed captions. Today, American Sign Language interpretation and communication real-time translation are available. Today's ASL interpreters are Andrea and Lissa. We very much appreciate the time and energy that they put into this. We know that this is important for us to provide this capability, but at the same time, we also have an awareness of the burden that it places on the interpreters. So we appreciate their work in this, and they're already spotlighted for you. We also appreciate the folks that are providing the CART captioning as well. As we begin today, we'd like to introduce Darwin. Darwin Largo is a member of the Navajo tribe. Darwin was born and raised in Crown Point, New Mexico. He attended Haskell Indian Nations University. He graduated from the University of Arizona, Zuckerman College of Public Health, obtaining a master's in public health and health behavior and health promotion. He was enticed to enter the field of public health because concepts of health and wellness are innate to the ancestral practices and cultural teachings of many American Indian and Alaskan Native villages. In his current role, Darwin is a research coordinator with Seven Directions, a tribal public health institute at the University of Washington. Darwin works on two projects, the Indigenous Social Determinants of Health Project and the NACCHO, National Association of City and County Health Organizations, data storytelling through participatory media that center indigenous knowledges and use storytelling methods. Later in this session, we'll also hear from our panelist, Jameson Green. Dr. Green is author and an independent scholar who has worked to develop the field of transgender health for over 30 years. He has conducted research on social determinants of health and advised on numerous research projects conducted by the NIH, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, the Center for Excellence for Transgender Health at the University of California, San Francisco, and the PRIDE study at Stanford University, which is a 100,000 person, 10-year longitudinal study for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. He is a former president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, and the author of Becoming a Visible Man, which was published by Vanderbilt University Press, first in 2004, and then again in an updated version in 2020. Jameson is located in Vancouver, Washington. With that, Darwin, it is all yours. You should have screen sharing capability, and we truly look forward to learning from your experience and particularly understanding the world of Indigenous people and storytelling.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I'm just preparing my slides, so is everyone able to see that? Great. All right, good morning. I'm going to begin by introducing myself in my Indigenous language. Yat e bene she Darwin Largo Yinishye, Tuchini Nishle, Oga Bashichin, Toiglini Dashiche, Bit Ani Dashinella, Akot Ego Dinen Nishle. It's those a dick esht. Hello, everybody. My name is Darwin Largo. I am Dene, a member of the Navajo tribe. I introduced myself in my native language to identify myself by name and our tribal clan system, to acknowledge my ancestors and identify my relatives. I am a Bitterwater born for the Zia Weaver people, and I was born and raised in a small reservation community in the Southwest United States, in a small community called Crown Point, New Mexico. I'm here today as the presenter for session 3 of the Knowledge, Narratives, and Numbers Echo series. The theme for today's session is Deeply Rooted Data, exploring traditional and indigenous best practices for storytelling. I appreciate the invitation to be a guest speaker, and I am grateful for the opportunity provided by NNPHI to present on subjects that are priorities for Indigenous communities and is reflective of the work I'm passionate about. As we get started, I want to begin by acknowledging that I am a culmination of my experiences, and the knowledge that I'm sharing today has been passed down to me through my family, my community, my ancestors, and other Indigenous knowledge keepers and scholars who have strived and continue to practice community wellness and healing. Next, I want to recognize the organization I'm representing. In my current role, I'm a research coordinator at Seven Directions. In 2016, Seven Directions became the first Indigenous public health institute in the United States that was solely dedicated to the health and well-being of American Indian and Alaska Native people. Seven Directions was born from a desire to strengthen relationships among tribal communities. We're a member of the National Network of Public Health Institutes, and since 2016, we've been joined by other Indigenous health institutes across the nation. Seven Sacred Directions serves as the Indigenous framework for our movement towards health equity. So our organization provides health education, research, and technical supports to tribal communities in the Pacific Northwest and to communities across the nation. I like to begin my presentations with positionality statements that are becoming more frequent in the social sciences. So in honor of sharing story, I wanted to share how I came into this work through a traditional story coupled with lived experiences. And later I will describe how it has informed my approach to Indigenous methodologies and the projects I'm a part of at Seven Directions. My worldview was shaped growing up on an American Indian reservation. I was raised on the periphery of the Western Agency of the Navajo Nation. Like many who grow up on a reservation, I experienced many of the challenges and hardships. My family lived in government housings until we moved on to a piece of private land in a more remote location. We did not have electricity or running water for a couple of months, and we would travel for grocery shopping and local entertainment for over an hour. But my heart belonged to those dirt roads, rocky plateaus, and mesas where my siblings and I played made-up games because there wasn't much else to do. My father's family owned livestock, sheep, and cattle, so my family was involved in husbandry. Land and animals were some of my first teachers. Indigenous scholar Sean Wilson, author of Research as Ceremony, says our upbringing shapes how we see and experience the world through our whole lives, and for scientists, it informs the questions we ask. I was first introduced to the field of public health through a Navajo folklore that was told to me repeatedly as a child by my grandmother. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, so I was fortunate enough that they passed these stories along. Long ago, my grandmother would say, monsters roamed the Navajo land, killing innocent people. The holy people witnessed the pain and suffering the Navajo people were enduring and blessed them with a set of twin brothers, Monster Slayer and Child Born for Raw Water, to restore Hajon, which is harmony in the Navajo language. The brothers mentally, physically, and spiritually matured into warriors in 12 days and set out to terminate the calamity that haunted the land. But before they could embark on this journey, they had to endeavor on a long and difficult journey to their father, the sun, to obtain weapons and sacred knowledge that were necessary in their fight against evil. Along their journey, they gained skills and tools from their non-human relatives. Once equipped, the brothers resumed their mission of eradicating monsters responsible for decimating their people. They succeeded in killing every deadly beast, but took pity on 3 monsters: poverty, disease, and old age. These were kept as challenges to teach people to be stronger, more self-reliant, and to help us live better lives. At the time, I did not understand the significance of this story. As I got older, I began to realize that monsters are still prevalent on the Navajo reservation and have made a permanent home with the exact same address in every tribal community across Indian country, and no one has been left unscathed. Another realization I had was that my grandparents gifted me these stories to teach me about how to live well. Many of the traditional stories have lessons and teachings about how to practice well-being and healing. So as mentioned in my introduction, I was enticed to the field of public health because concepts of health and wellness are innate to the ancestral practices and teachings of many American Indians and Alaska Native villages. So my research interest in public health has always been health equity, health disparities, social determinants of health, indigenous methodologies, mental health, and psychopathology. I want to share this quote by Indigenous scholar Brian Grayboy that has served as the basis for many of the projects that I'm currently involved in. The quote reads, "Stories are not separate from theory. They make up theory and are sources of data and ways of being." So I tell you all of this to say that stories are our data. Stories have everything you need to be well, and our indigenous people have always been collectors, creators, and users of data. Data is not a foreign concept. Since time immemorial, indigenous people have been using it. This can be seen in the winter counts used by the Plains tribes in the Blackfeet, Kiowa, Mandan, and the Lakota people, where weather patterns and notable other events were documented using pictograms on hides of animals. So you see that image here on the left-hand side of the screen with those drawings. In the middle is a picture I took at the Totolina trading post, which is renowned for selling rugs from Navajo people. There's a pretty, I'm trying to describe this. Okay, there's a pretty profound image on these rugs that is based and rooted in one of the worst atrocities in human history. However, its meaning for the Navajo people is the swirling logs, and it's very sacred to the Navajo people, but has been corrupted by other users. It was used to document times when weather patterns, it was used to document when the weather was windy, but it also represents the 4 elements and the 4 cardinal directions that the Navajo people hold true to many other concepts. And then on the lower right is the wampum belts from the Iroquois Confederacy that use beaded patterns to represent population, important events, shared values, and agreements. Even though these knowledge systems existed, Western paradigms and best practices have often excluded Indigenous voices and storytelling methods. These are systematic methods to eradicate Indigenous knowledge. Despite the fact there has been a resurgence of indigeneity, where Native communities are developing culturally grounded Indigenous health promotion programs, educational curriculums, and language revitalization programs that center Native cultural worldviews and protocols in their design and process. This leads me to discuss the current project that I'm involved in, the Indigenous Social Determinants of Health project. I want to have the acknowledgement of our funders that have allowed us to do this incredible work. So we're supported by the Center for Disease Control. And we are in partnership with the National Network of Public Health Institutes that has collaborated with 7 Directions. So when we began this work, we started with 3 very early objectives. And the first was to uplift Indigenous perspectives on social determinants of health. The second was to center Indigenous knowledge systems, and the third was to celebrate Indigenous worldviews and concepts of health, healing, and well-being. So our early work began in the literature. We started early literature reviews and environmental scans to understand the landscape of social determinants of health. What we began to understand was that health disparities among American Indians and Alaska Natives were well documented. There's a lot of evidence that supports that Indigenous people are suffering some of the worst health disparities as compared to their non-Native counterparts. We fall at every end of the spectrum in terms of economic stability, education access and quality, healthcare access and quality, neighborhood and built environment, and social and community contexts. And these are the 5 constructs that have been defined by Western frameworks of social determinants of health. But as we begin to look deeper, we started to understand that not all of these are completely applicable to the tribal nations. We felt like there was other risk and protective factors that contribute to social determinants of health. And we also felt like more upstream determinants weren't named in these Western frameworks. So which led us to Our Stories, Our Journeys, a series of community meetings that we held with tribal nations across the country. Our Stories, Our Journeys is a community-based initiative to center Indigenous knowledge to better understand the factors and forces that influence community health across Indigenous communities. We have priorities in these community-based initiatives. They were to acknowledge the unique history of American Indians and Alaska Natives, but also to raise the visibility of Indigenous perspectives of social determinants of health, and then begin to describe what Indigenous determinants of health are. So as I mentioned, what we were aiming to do was to uplift and center Indigenous knowledge and perspectives of social determinants of health. So we held 5 regional meetings across the United States with tribal communities. Our community meetings consisted of tribal elders, Indigenous public health professionals, scholars, and emerging career professionals. So in order to have conversations around health, we held semi-facilitated discussions where we first asked people to draw their life and use the metaphor of a river. Water is very sacred to a lot of Native people, so it wasn't hard for a lot of our participants and attendees of our community meetings to create visualizations of their journey. So this is one that I had created, and I told my story in the beginning, so you can kind of see that I grew up in a very desolate community in the Four Corners region of the United States. And a very big part of my story had been education, coming from a rural community and the role that culture has played in my life. So some of those facilitated discussion questions were, if your life was a river, what shape would it take? Also, what relationships have been foundational to your journey? What brought you to health equity work? And how have you centered your values and morals in your work? So our overall goal was to create a space and place where we could document what Indigenous determinants of health were. And so we were inspired by the work of Dr. Stephanie Carroll and many others who started this work. And so through our community meetings, we were able to aggregate some of the discussion questions and analyze them to create. We worked with a graphic facilitator to then begin to create these collective images. So what you're seeing on the screen is graphic illustrations of our discussions and some of the themes and conversations that were involved. So we held community meetings in Fort Berthold with the 3 affiliated tribes. And just to take you through some of the context, one of the major impacts that they were facing was that they had a really big connection to the river. However, it was disrupted when U.S. policy kind of removed it from their access, and then began using it for other industrial purposes. So what they had been seeing in their community was that a lot of people were kind of looking towards their language, and they had seen their language as a protective factor against a lot of the health disparities that they had been facing. So one of the quotes that has really stood out to us in our work is, "When I speak my language, I know who I am and where I come from." Another meeting that we held was with tribal college and university students from the Midwest. And it was really cool to be a part of this process because they talked about what it meant, what education has meant, despite education having a legacy of colonial efforts during kind of like the termination periods of American Indian policy. They also talked about kind of this imperative moment everyone has when they think about the responsibilities to their communities and why it's important for them to obtain an education and go back to help their communities. So we've been trying to understand what are those broader determinants, and they include what we see in the Western frameworks as far as socioeconomic status, housing availability, access to educational opportunities, and access to healthcare. And so when we start to think about what is shared Indigenous determinants, you can look at what is happening in the Southwest in the ongoing context of Southwest tribes and what is being experienced by the Plains Indians. And then you can kind of start to see very similar determinants. And those tribally specific ones I can give an example as to one in the Southwest. During our community meetings, an elder had described an art form that she was involved in that had been passed down by her grandparents. And it's where she folds pieces of paper and makes these flowers. But she talked about it in a way that is true to the culture. They even have classes around it. But it's really an opportunity during that time to reflect and kind of give all of your stressors to that form of art, and it's a kind of like a letting go, catharsis in a way. So from these stories, we were able to obtain these kind of 5 major constructs of shared indigenous determinants that include indigenous knowledge systems, language and identity, land and kinship, sovereignty, and structural and systemic factors. So what does that mean for public health and the work that we're aiming to do, and what were we able to create from these stories? First, we were able to develop an Indigenous Social Determinants of Health webpage under 7 Directions. This webpage is going to be launching at the end of June. It's really awesome to think about because I've been working on this project while I was a student at the University of Arizona, and to see it actually come to life is it's really cool. And while presenting on this topic, a lot of interest has been in Indigenous social determinants of health. So our webpage is going to consist of materials, resources, and even connections to other Indigenous scholars who are doing work in this area. And lastly, with these stories, we were able to curate health training modules for community health workers. And as I have been mentioning, stories are really important for informing our worldviews and then the actions that we take. So it is included in our module 1 to have a reflexive activity for people to begin to see the values and their morals and ethics that inform kind of the work that they're involved in or the work that they're looking to do. We're also providing a basis, foundational, I guess, education on what social determinants of health are and how structural and systemic determinants continue to impact the livelihoods of Indigenous people across North America. And then we're going to kind of flip the script to look at social determinants from an Indigenous lens, which is always strength-based. And then at the end, people will have the tools necessary to think about who they want to partner with, what relationships are foundational to the work that they do, and also thinking about the methods of how to achieve some of their health equity goals. That concludes my formal presentation. I just want to thank you for allowing me this time and space to present on who I am, the organization I represent, and the project that I'm involved in. So here are some discussion questions.
Thank you, Darwin. That was incredibly informative. And let's keep this screen up here because we'll go to this in just a second. But really informative presentation, and particularly connecting with water, river, land, and the earth. Those are important for, I think, for all of us to understand and appreciate. One thing that I want to mention before we ask Jameson to respond first to your presentation, and then we'll go to these questions. The image in my background is actually, while we call it a lake in Austin, it's Colorado River. And upstream, less than a mile from this location is Barton Springs, which is fed by an aquifer, and Indigenous people in Austin or in the Austin area have been using that as a water source going back 12,000 years. Also, it's probably important, I should have mentioned this at the outset, and I'm going to apologize if I have some of the pronunciation wrong. But Austin was occupied in the ancestral home by the Tonkawa, Lipan Apache, Karankawa, Comanche, and Cowatecan people over his lifetime. The European colonists have only been here a short period of time. And so if you think in terms of the 12,000 years, that gives you a perspective of what this area has been, has sustained life for people for a very, very long time. So with that, Jameson, any thoughts on just Darwin's presentation, and then we'll go into the questions?
I just really love this presentation. Darwin, you did a fantastic job outlining the history, your personal perspectives, illustrating the concepts that you're trying to get across. It's just an incredible resource to think about. I know from a perspective of a descendant of European colonists, I grew up on this land myself, and I live in the Pacific Northwest, where we are surrounded by rivers, and rivers are so important. I feel very deeply connected to the land where I live, and I've always respected the indigenous perspective and been sensitive to the colonization that has taken place, and struggled with how to restore the balance in our cultures. And your presentation is a tremendous doorway to helping that process. And I appreciate it very, very much.
So with that, thank you, Jameson. Let's look at the first two questions. We'll start with Darwin responding to, and then Jameson and I responding to that, and then we'll do the next two questions that Jameson would lead with, and Darwin and I will respond back. So Darwin, what are the differences between decolonizing and indigenizing approaches?
Yeah, I started kind of the presentation recording with real loose definitions of what decolonizing and indigenization are. Decolonizing can be seen as the undoing of the colonizing structures that are in place, while indigenizing is putting those indigenous knowledge front and center. I'm trying to think about specific examples, but decolonizing is often coming from a place of undoing and then reweaving. So you see this a lot in indigenous research and even evaluation when there are already systems in place, kind of taking those structures and reorganizing them for the benefit and the inclusion of marginalized communities, including indigenous people. On the other hand, indigenizing is starting from a place that really centers indigenous worldviews and perspectives. So culturally grounded interventions are examples of indigenizing approaches. And I really rely on some of the work, the scholarly work that has been done in our field by the people at my organization, but also organizations that we collaborate with, like the Urban Indian Health Board, where they have Abigail Echo Hawk serving as their executive director, who oftentimes says, we're still facing health disparities because the health system wasn't designed by or for us. So once we become culturally grounded in our ways of knowing, being, and doing, then we can start to look at the problem and then figure out solutions that we know true to ourselves and our people.
Jameson, any thoughts?
I think those are very, very helpful and comprehensive definitions of those terms, and I really appreciate it.
And Darren, I appreciate you bringing up Abigail Echo Hawk. She was the plenary speaker at last year's National Network of Public Health Institute annual conference, and really provided not only insight, but enough substance that people were talking about her presentation all through that. I know that we use in some of our work at Texas Health Institute. One of the comments that she made about evidence-based data, essentially your evidence-based data is not evidence-based data if it doesn't include my evidence-based data in it, which I think was incredibly important for the work that Jameson and I have been involved with. So let's go to the second question. What does integration of Indigenous knowledge look like in public health research and praxis?
I really like this question because I think a lot of tribal communities are kind of looking for direction in terms of how to apply maybe their Indigenous knowledges or practices into public health research and praxis. So while giving iterations of this presentation and beginning to formulate what Indigenous social determinants of health are, we've met so many incredible organizations, nonprofits across the United States. And one that really stands out to me is Thunder Valley CDC from South Dakota, who has really been embodying an Indigenous social determinants of health framework. So they're a nonprofit in South Dakota for the Lakota people, and they're addressing root causes. And I believe, if I recall correctly, that their main mission is the liberation of Lakota people. So they created these constructs based around their cultural knowledges and languages to have programs like food sovereignty, where they grow their own food. They built housing to address kind of like the housing crisis on their reservation. They've also have community programs for sobriety, mental health providers. And so they've really been one of the major organizations that I can clearly look at and say that they really did start from a foundation of Lakota culture and really centering what is central to a lot of Native tribes is that idea of respect and family. And then another example I can give about what Indigenous knowledge looks like in health research and praxis is from our own organization at Seven Directions, where members of our team have created an Indigenous evaluation toolkit to begin to look at other sources of data aside from numerical values, as well as kind of like qualitative approaches to think about things like songs, stories, and different art forms, and to begin to integrate that into is this program working? Is it working for us? And so I really credit them with the development of the tools that tribes are going to be able to use.
Jameson, any thoughts? And I've got something I want to pick up on that comment too. Jameson?
I just agree so much with what Darwin is saying. It's great observations.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's fascinating to me and important and really, Darren, kind of goes to how you actually do storytelling, do this presentation. You use illustrative or words that are provide imagery, like reweaving. As soon as you said that, I just kind of was seeing how a basket could be rewoven mentally. And I think, so much of history has been oral history that's passed down generation to generation, and just the knowledge and being able to keep that information centered within the different tribes is important. And it's something I think that folks that are not Indigenous can learn from that experience, because too often we lose sight of history, we lose sight of the people that we're a part of. And so really impressed about how you talk about Indigenous knowledge and how to share that, particularly from public health research. And I would love to see that toolkit. We've had similar discussions about it. It's not just a quantitative data, but it's a qualitative. What do we learn from just listening to folks and sharing that information, which is also part of Project ECHO, which is what this project is, which is how do we all learn from each other? How do we teach? And so that's important. So Jameson, question 3, why is it important to consider ethical and cultural protocols when involved with public health research and practice when working with Indigenous communities?
Well, I think that the ethics of research and the ethics of healthcare delivery often comes from the perspective of the training that those of us engaged in those practices, receive through our specific art. Nurses have a certain code of ethics, physicians have a certain code of ethics, research has a code of ethics. And I think those are still applicable, but when we apply them to an Indigenous or a minority community, we have to remember that we're trying to build connections and that we're trying to build respect and cooperation. And without the specific awareness of the culture and the kind of communication that's being practiced by the population you're serving, health professionals risk alienating the population that they're trying to serve and to care for. And listening and learning learning what's important to that patient population, and showing respect for their ways of seeing, of thinking, of speaking, and of relating to the world around them enables trust to be established. And often people won't stay in relationship or cooperate with people they don't trust. So to keep people in care and to keep people engaged in building networks of knowledge acquisition, that trust has to be established. People need to feel seen and heard, and to have their needs respected and seen and taken seriously. And I think respect is very important to people who are or have been marginalized.
Good points. Good points. Darwin, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for your comments, Jameson. I think all of that is incredibly relevant to the conversation of working with Indigenous communities. And in my first iteration of creating this presentation, I had a slide dedicated to what do ethical and cultural protocols look like. And it's so comprehensive, but also diverse, thinking about the different tribes that you're able to work with. But really it comes down to having a strong foundation and centering your ethical and cultural protocols in respect. John, you mentioned having an open mind, and I think that's really important when coming into work with communities that may not be your own. We always say that we have an open mind, open heart to hearing what community priorities are and how to solve those problems. When I was working as an undergraduate in communities in the Midwest, it was always really interesting to see the dynamic of tribal communities, because behind every tribal community there is one strong woman who is just taking everyone by the hand and introducing them to everybody. So I think that's been really imperative to the work I do now, as well as my foundations and my upbringing in my own Navajo culture, because we were always taught, like, go introduce yourself. In Navajo, you say, Hash, yeah, what's your name and who is your family? Where do you come from? And as I've traveled through tribal communities, it's really interesting to see their mistrust of research and outsiders who are just trying to help. But I think they really care about, like, what is in your heart and what is true to you. And I think the ethical portion of this conversation is really important to consider, because data hasn't always been in the hands of tribal communities. It has often been used against us, whether that be misclassification or clear eradication of what we know and who we are as people. And so there's a movement in academia, research, and even in evaluation that centers Indigenous data sovereignty by, for, and the creation by Indigenous people. So I just wanted to add that.
That last thought is absolutely important, and it's not to take away at all from Indigenous people, but for a lot of communities that have been basically invisible for a lot of their existence, that absolutely is important. I know Jameson and I can relate to some of that from our discussions earlier. The other thing I've definitely taken away, and it will credit you obviously, but it's the open mind, open heart. I think that's a phrase that I truly can think we can use. At least I know I can use it in some of the work we do, but I suspect that a lot of us can use that as we go forward. And that gets back to Jameson's earlier point about this. All of our collaborations don't work if we don't build trust with each other. And that's such crucial to that. So for our last question, Jameson, how can non-natives be good relatives in public health research and practice?
That word relatives is really important. Recognize that you are part of a community when you enter a community to do research or provide care. Listen, reflect, respond respectfully, and understand your own relationship to the community and the context in which you are living or participating. I think what Darwin says about introduce yourself, tell about who you are, that puts you on an equal footing, and it makes you vulnerable, and you have to be as open and vulnerable as you expect people to be with you. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Yeah, Darwin, thoughts, and then I have one on that one as well, but go ahead, Darwin.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, considering the fact that I've been in mainstream institutions and research organizations that have been predominantly white. And so I think there just needs to be more space and opportunity available to Indigenous people. But also, I don't want to leave out other marginalized communities. I think the idea of introducing yourself, coming to the work, and being transparent as to what you're aiming to achieve, I think it's very telling when people go into communities. Like, we often find out who you are, and, like, especially smaller communities, who you are and what your aims are. And if it's not congruent with our own, then there's already a level of mistrust. And I always recall a book that I read that talks about we should think about relationships as a muscle. And as we continue to work that out and be involved in relationships, and strengthening that muscle, the stronger it gets, as opposed to what can I take from it? What can I leave with this, and having a depletion of resources. And so whenever I approach work with non-natives, it's always this idea of, how are you co-constructing your knowledge? Are you making space and opportunity available for people who maybe are in lower positions than you? Are you entering communities and leaving behind good medicine? Are you entering partnerships that are going to benefit and, as I mentioned, like leave good results behind? And will this stay in the hands of the community? I think those are all considerations for non-natives, but also to come from a level of understanding as to our unique histories. I feel like we're not in a position to kind of make the sacrifice and do all the hard work to teach you. So some of that learning has to come from non-natives as well. And there's a lot of resources out there. So I always appreciate when people come to me or our organization and want to learn from us, or ask them to point them in the direction of how they can better understand Indigenous perspectives. So that's kind of what I wanted to add.
Yeah, excellent points. I think on a couple of things. One was vulnerability, and I grew up with things like management by objectives, and there was only one way to present yourself, essentially, if you wanted to, quote, get ahead, and that type of thing, and making yourself vulnerable in that kind of context, just that was one way to ensure that you were not going to be in that position for very long. So it's, how do we go about unlearning a lot of things that some of us that are older have grown up with, and how do we ensure that younger generations don't have to go through that same unlearning process at some point in the future? And then the other one I think that you brought up is probably one of the most important things that we should all be aware of in allies and any kind of forum working with organizations that have either been invisible or have been marginalized in the past. I know some of the work that we do is in this realm. And allies need to not only step up, but share a large part of the burden. It's not up to the population that's been affected to have to carry this all the time. It has to be, the allies have to be out there in front. And so when we think about non-natives being good relatives, that's a really good way to look at this, is not only be good relatives, but how can we learn and then share what's important and take ownership of carrying a large part of that burden, so that it doesn't rest on just Indigenous people or different groups as well. So great conversation. I really have enjoyed this opportunity to visit with the two of you all. Also want to, as we wrap up, recognize the important and valuable contributions that Alyssa and Andrea have done in terms of the sign language, and then in our closed captioning people. And then two unsung heroes that don't get very much visibility, but are absolutely crucial to the work that we've been doing, are Serena and Kimberly. I personally can't thank you enough for all the work that you do, and the others within NNPHI and your organizations, the Public Health Institutes do, in putting these projects together. This project was funded by CDC through the National Network of Public Health Institutes, through the a long name is OT 21-2103, but essentially it's a health disparities project. And it has, I know that this is the third of our storytelling mini echoes. And I hope that for everyone that's watching this one, and if this is your first one, that you'll also go back and look at the two previous sessions. And these are going to be up for some time, because it's important. You know, we know as adults that after we watch some of this, we tend to lose some of that information over time. So one of the valuable parts of this project is this information is going to be up there for us to go back to and refresh memories. But once again, Darwin and Jameson, thank you for your time today. And with that, thanks everyone for taking part in this particular storytelling echo. And we look forward to seeing you in other mini echoes or virtual sessions as we go forward into the future. Thank you, and hope everyone has a good week wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in.